I'm Will Harling, like he said, the director of Mid Klamath Watershed Council. I grew up on the Salmon River, and I do have a little intro as part of the PowerPoint. So I think I'm going to share my screen and just go right into that. I want to apologize for everyone. I'm on day 3 of COVID, so I'm in isolation at my home. And it's definitely kicked my butt. I think it's the Omicron, so it hasn't gotten into my lungs. So hopefully I don't sound too horrible, but I'm not my normal cheery self right now. So anyways, bear with me. I have been incredibly blessed to have been part of the founding and the growth of the Mid Klamath Watershed Council organization. Since 2001, we've been serving the Middle Klamath region from basically Iron Gate Dam down to the Trinity River, and working closely with our tribal partners and federal and state partners as well. This is a picture of a board and staff meeting with some of the amazing people I get to work with on a daily basis. This is a picture of me. I'm sitting there on my pop's lap. My dad just passed 8 months ago. This is the cabin I was born in up on the Salmon River. You can see my pop's left leg has a cast on it. He was a logger. Broke his leg logging right before this picture was taken, right before the 77 hog fire. And that's my brother Tim holding the dog Yarder there. Tim, that's Tim on the left there too. He grew up to be a lifelong timber faller. He ended up breaking his leg logging too, and both him and my dad turned to me and they said, you better do something besides logging. You should look into something else. And so that kind of put me on a path to where I am today, which is working through MICWIC to facilitate watershed restoration, fish habitat restoration, as well as restoring fire regimes at a larger scale. We also have a community stewardship program. We run a community center and do a bunch of cool stuff up and down the river. If you're ever in the incredible metropolis of Orleans, stop by our office and say hi. But I'm here today to talk about the Klamath Mountains, a place where I've spent my life. This land is so diverse. I love this picture that I took from Soames Peak, looking east towards Thompson Peak, which is the highest mountain range in the Klamath Mountains at 9,000 feet. And the trees in the foreground speak to the diversity of this landscape. You have a brewer spruce on the left, which is one of the most fire avoiding species, literally rubbing branches below where this picture was taken with a knobcone pine, which is a fire obligate, meaning that it needs fire for its cones to open and go to seed. So you have these incredibly opposite fire regimes just cutting on a knife edge on these ridges. And that's the diversity that David Rains Wallace wrote about in the Klamath Knot, this incredible jumble of slope aspect, topography, elevation, soils that led to both a floristic and a floristic diversity, as well as a diversity of animals. In this story too, you can see, the high country snow that gets held in the mountains. And then in the mid-range, you can see that ridge that's just dense with mid-mature Douglas fir. And that speaks to the issues of fire exclusion that we're experiencing today. Now, luckily, there's photos like this 1944 aerial photo that speak to the time before fire exclusion, where you can see those vegetation patterns of what the forests look like, you know, before, you know, we started excluding fire and stopping indigenous burning practices. You know, the upper thirds of the slopes were either bare or sparsely vegetated. The north side of the ridge usually had old growth with meadow systems that was, you know, 30 to 50% canopy closure, so the snow could fall to the ground, but then be shaded and preserve that snowpack. And it naturally broke up fires as it moved across the landscape. Now, the Forest Service, with the 1911 Weeks Act, you know, banned fire from the landscape, and perhaps nowhere else in California more than the Klamaths, that began a war between native peoples who depended on fire for their very culture and existence, and the nascent Forest Service, who saw fire suppression as a way to create contiguous stands of timber to feed the country's need for lumber. So you can see in these quotes from the first Region 5 regional forester, S.P. Shao, you know, it was very intentional, taking fire out of the landscape to grow trees. And the reality is that they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. You know, the forests that botanists like Wieslander documented in the 1930s, you could just see the first signs of the ingrowth that was happening at that time. You know, his pictures, the one that just came in as the inset is one of two pictures he chose to take in Orleans. And you can see it's of Douglas fir growing up in an open black oak or white oak stand. And unfortunately, you know, we've lost, you know, 30 to 70% of our meadow habitats and oak woodland habitats. These next slides are just a small example of that, you know, from Red Cap Glade, just west of Orleans in 1944. Fast forward to 2005, and it doesn't exist. And on the right, this picture from Big Rock, looking upriver towards Offield Mountain. If you look at the ridge lines, you know, both in the middle distance and then in the foreground, you know, the difference between then and now is extreme. I mean, basically, in the absence of fire, mesic species like Douglas fir and tan oak have invaded the landscape, the south-facing slopes, and completely altered how fire moves across the landscape. So much of indigenous burning practices have been lost, but, you know, luckily in our area, a lot of that knowledge has persisted. You know, the three largest tribes in California, the Hupa, the Karuk, and the Yurok, all live in this area where the Trinity meets the Klamath, and then up the Klamath towards I-5. And this map from 1931 of fires in the Hupa Square speaks to indigenous burning practices. You can see these little red dots are fire starts, and they trace trail systems. They trace specific patches in oak woodlands where they were burning into next year's fire or last year's fire or the year before that's fire. So these frequent fire on fire interactions to enhance cultural resources, to maintain that 1 to 2 mile buffer around their communities, and to, you know, burning for hunting, for game, as well as the food and fiber resources. This is a map of the Karuk ancestral territory on the left, which basically goes from the mouth of Trinity around Aikens Creek on the Klamath all the way up to Syed Valley, including most of the Salmon River. Incredibly steep, rugged terrain, not a lot of people, and being completely rewritten by high severity fire over the past 30, 40 years, basically my lifetime. This is where I live on the Salmon River. My house is in the far background there. This is the lower Salmon River. And I've seen so much change just in my time alone. But to see the real change, you have to go even further back. This picture taken in the 1880s, I believe, is of Katamin, which is the center of the Karuk world at Ishipishi Falls. And this area where the world renewal ceremonies take place, and where the ceremony of burning Off-Field Mountain, Ekaria Tuiship, at the new moon in September every year was practiced for millennia up until 1917. But even in the short amount of time between 1880 and around 1900, you can see, actually, the picture that just showed up is the 1880 photo, and the one previously was from 1900. I'm going to toggle that back again, because you can see just in that short amount of time, 20 years, even before fire exclusion, there was densification of the forest going on because of genocide and the cessation of indigenous burning practices. The bounty of resources created through this kind of scalpel point use of fire for specific resource benefits created an incredible cultural diversity. So many things in this picture, from Brizard's store, where Native people traded their goods for food, just speak to the fire on the landscape, from the hazel to the bear grass to the willow. All those things required fire to be born, to be harvestable quality. These women like Daisy Jacobs and Indian Ned, these folks knew more about fire and how to use it than probably most anybody alive today. And that ability for the culture to persist over time is dependent on them continuing to be able to use fire at the landscape scale. Luckily, some people like Kathy McCovey, Frank Lake, Bill Tripp still carry on a lot of this knowledge and help share it with us non-native folks, so we can support them as they try to restore their cultural burning practices and bring fire back to the landscape in a good ways. But we've come a long way since that time. So much of the forests have been industrially logged starting in the 50s in our area, right around the time we started getting serious about fire exclusion. And the effects have been severe. These are photos from my friend Karuna Greenberg's house up on the Salmon River that burned twice, once in the 77 hog fire and once again in the 87 fire. The picture on the right is the landscape that just burned for the fourth time, right above my parents' house, and it's incredible. It's affected the Salmon River incredibly over that time. This map of on the left here, that it's a map that we created for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership landscape that shows fire overlaps. And I recommend everybody check out the CAL FIRE FRAP website that has these map products, these fire overlaps map products, so you can see on your own landscape that fire history, and it will help wrap your head around both the risk as well as opportunities for using fire. All the purple in this map is places that haven't burned since recorded history, since the early 1900s. The most fire overlaps we have on any piece of ground is 5 overlaps. And the reality is that if fire was never taken off this landscape, we would see 30 to 100 fire overlaps on that map. It would look completely different. there's never been a time since the last ice age that we've seen so little fire on this landscape. Now we're coming out of one of the wettest centuries on record into one of the driest centuries on record. And so fire suppression forces who thought they could continue to suppress fire forever are starting to get their butts kicked. And we're seeing this huge uptick in high severity fire. Basically all the areas that haven't burned are burning, and they're burning at high severity with high rapidity, and the fire behavior is like nothing we've ever seen before. The White's fire that burned up Tanner's Peak created a pyrocumulonimbus cloud that spread lightning for 70 miles from the Salmon River into Southern Oregon, lighting fires as far away as Happy Camp, that then burned another 130,000 acres that summer. So these images of that one run of the White's fire on a wind-driven event in 2014, just show, it's redefining what we think of when we think of spot fires. A fire that can create lightning 50, 60 miles away. It's unheard of. And when we look at the causes of why that fire did what it did when it made its run, in this map, the red is the area that hadn't burned in over 100 years. And that's the area that had all that fuels, that carbureted fuel mixture that allowed that fire to create that pyrocumulonimbus cloud. And the impacts to the landscape after a fire that hot, so much of the topsoil runs into the rivers, the pools get shallower, the water gets hotter, just 100% mortality, so many impacts to the landscape over time. And we're literally seeing these salmon streams, these key coho streams just blinking off one after another. And, there's it's bittersweet when you look at a creek like Grider Creek that, on the left, this was after the 2014 fires. We had a midsummer thunderstorm in July of 2015, and it literally filled up the entire lower 20 miles of Grider Creek with sediment. And the good news is that if you're a fisheries biologist, we reached stage 0 immediately. The creek was connected to the floodplain again. Of course, the in-stream effects were pretty catastrophic, and spawning impacts for several years are going to be severe for salmon. Now, on the flip side, having no fire is not good for fish either. Streams like Redcap Creek that didn't have fire for over 110 years, these streams start to incise as the vegetation armors the sides of the stream, and all the stream can do is cut down instead of activating the floodplain. And so fire thins that vegetation on the shores and allows the streams to activate the floodplain. Also, we're seeing 3 to 4 times the historic stem densities in our forests that haven't burned. And so all that is just sucking up water, especially in the summer when we need it most for our fish. So, and then of course, it's just priming the pump for that next high severity wildfire. Now, fire traditionally played a really valuable role to rivers and streams and fish habitat. In this picture on Elk Creek, you can see, large wood being recruited into the stream, small amounts of spawning gravels being input. Fire was the conveyor belt that brought that sediment and wood and biochar into the stream environment that made those rich habitats. Similarly, the role of smoke is essential on the southern range of salmon to cool our streams during the summer months. All the historic accounts talk about this persistent haze of smoke. Now, when we have no smoke at all during the summer, We start to see like this picture on the right that I took at the mouth of Crapo Creek, where, we lost 300 of our 700 spring salmon that came into the river that year due to excessive heat. And fish were literally jumping out of the main stem river onto the rocks, trying to get into cold water tributaries to survive. Just really traumatic. And as fate would have it, a week after I took that picture, an arsonist drove up the Salmon River Road and lit a bunch of wildfires, and actually passed me in the Forks of Salmon, which is kind of where those two tributaries come together in this picture. And on their way upriver, lighting fires. And, the silver lining to that was that salmon stopped dying. As soon as the drainage smoked in, the river dropped about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fish survived. So, just a thought as we look at, salmon conservation through the eyes of fire ecology, this role of, managing fire correctly so that we steward our streams is critical. I dove under a ledge on the North Fork of the Salmon in 2014, and there was this 20 plus pound Chinook, just pus bag rotten, died of heat. We're really failing our salmon relations at this point. And I started out a fisheries biologist. I became a fire ecologist because I don't think we can solve the fish problem without solving the fire problem first. And the fire problem is growing. This is what I saw in September 8th, 2020, Black Tuesday, when we got to Happy Camp and the newly purchased Mickwick engine with the Slater fire coming over the ridge from Slater Butte towards town. This fire did things I've never seen before. It was blown by 50-mile-an-hour winds with 3% humidity. It burned over 90,000. It was actually closer to 120,000 acres in one 24-hour period. It literally burned half the town of Happy Camp, killed 3 people. And the reality was, if it wasn't for the Eclipse fire and the Oak fire, which had burned in 2017, 2018, just to the west, my friend Lee Tarnay, a fire modeler, showed that fire would have burned all the way to the coast and burned down the town of Crescent City. So just a cautionary tale to folks who live in the Lost Coast. What the fate of the interior landscapes is linked to you, especially as we see the number of east wind events during the summer increase greatly. I mean, we used to have 1 to 2 east wind events a summer, 10 to 20 years ago, and now we're seeing 10 to 15. And then, this day that when the Slater fire lit, that was they say it's a once in every 100 years event. But the reality is that's quickly changing. One of our board members, Dean Davis, lost his home, beautiful mid-slope home in Indian Creek, and nearly lost his life trying to defend that beautiful home in that fire. He'd successfully defended it from fire before, but this fire was like nothing he'd ever seen before. Before the flaming front even got there, the wind-blown river of embers had invaded, every little piece of his house. And right when he went to try and start putting out all the little spot fires in his house is when the fire burned up his water supply, and he just had to hunker down in the middle of the meadow and watch his life burn up around him. In total, 4 of our Mickwick board members lost their homes in that fire. Now, the red salmon fire that was burning at the same time shows an interesting story. You can see it's the red boundary line there. It was stopped by the 2013 Butler fire footprint that was lit by that arsonist I talked about, but yet it spread through the 1999 Megram fire footprint. Now, this is consistent with a pattern we've seen, is that recent fire footprints can stop even extreme wildfires, 5 to 10 years after they've burned. So this kind of fire on fire interactions piece is really key to how fires were managed historically, and also how they should be managed today. However, most state and federal managers don't often incorporate that into their fire management. The other kind of cool thing about, the red salmon complex was the Forest Service was so desperate for resources, they ended up asking me to embed in a firing team as the fire came down to the town of Forks of Salmon under a heavy inversion. And we were able to burn 400 acres in a day with about 6 people, and burn fire down to the fire line at the edge of the community. We had less than 10% high severity. For all intents and purposes, it was a prescribed burn, except we didn't have to do any permitting, no smoke management stuff, no burn plans, no grant funding, none of the stuff that we normally have to do. And that really kind of rung a bell for me. It was like, oh yeah, fire suppression people get it. They're just realizing that, you can avoid all liability and just manage fire through wildfires. But the unfortunate thing is, even though it's a lot less work, the impacts of that style of management are severe, and I really call it the least liability way of managing fire. And that's what we've embraced as a culture in this nation, and it's really maximizing the negative impacts of fire on the landscape. 98+% of the fires are suppressed, and the few fires that do escape initial attack do so because they start at the hottest, driest times of year, which means that they burn at a greater proportion with high intensity fire and cause much greater risk to firefighters and communities. So we need to get out of this paradigm. We need to create a social and cultural movement to change how we manage fire and how we look at fire on the landscape. And for us, on the Klamath, that's meant, embracing all of these national programs like the Fire Safe Councils, Firewise programs, and the Community Liaison program, which actually evolved on the Salmon River after the 2008 wildfire season, which gave us our community a seat at the table with incoming incident management teams who are managing these wildfire incidents, to programs like the Fire Adapted Communities and Fire Learning Networks, and prescribed burn associations that help get communities on the same page when it comes to thinking about fire management. For us, the Fire Safe Council was definitely the first venue that brought us together. And it happened after the 2001 Orleans fire that nearly burned down the town of Orleans. And I was so proud of the folks in our community because, they realized that it wasn't just about protecting a structure or resources. It was about restoring historic fire regimes. And so for the past 20 plus years, that's what we've been working towards. And really it kind of started out with us reinventing the prescribed burn association model, where a bunch of us just started getting together on the weekends and burning each other's properties. And at that point, nobody was paying attention too much, and it was pretty easy to burn. We would show up and like one guy like Max Creasy in this picture would start burning while the rest of us started scratching line at the same time he was lighting, and no personal protective equipment, no nothing, and no accidents. We got a ton of acres burned. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with, an ex-Forest Service burn boss like John Gibbons in this picture, and a drip torch, and a couple fire lines. It's amazing what you can get done through that model. But as soon as we started accepting grant funds, of course, then we started having to wear PPE and get insurance and, keep our grants going and get permits and all that stuff. It was a slippery slope. Our first collaborative project with the Forest Service didn't go too well. The OCFR project ended up in litigation with the tribe when the Forest Service kind of reneged on some of their promises on the first couple units they implemented, and so that kind of facilitated us forming the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, because we realized it had to do with the definition of collaboration. For us, collaboration wasn't you listen to us and then you go do what you want to do. Collaboration was, we don't do anything unless everybody agrees to do it. And so through the formation of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership in 2013, we brought together all these local, tribal, state, federal NGOs, and we worked together on this landscape, which was primarily federally managed by the Klamath and Six Rivers National Forest, but also pretty congruous with the Kuduk Aboriginal Territory. And we worked around, we basically didn't talk about all the things we disagreed on. We talked about our shared values, and we came up with these 6 shared core values: sustainable local economies, cultural and community vitality, fire adapted communities, restored fire regimes, resilient biodiverse forests, plants, animals, and fish, and healthy river systems. And so that kind of guided us through this process. It was like building a foundation together, the loggers, the preacher, the environmental groups, NGOs, the tribe, Forest Service, working together. And we realized we had way more in common than we actually thought. And it was so powerful that, we were able to start planning these much larger projects and to really conceptualize what fire management at the landscape scale look like through a social, a cultural, ecological, and economic perspective. And I really am a big fan of the open standards process for conservation. I strongly suggest that folk or other groups in your area look into it and engage in this type of planning. For us, it was the difference from, warring and conflict over each timber sale to, collaborating and getting shared funding together, working together towards a shared future. One of the key things that WKRP created was this overlay assessment, which was basically taking 24 different geographic layers, spatial layers that represented our shared values, like, native trail systems or elk habitat or mid-mature dense first-hands or private property, and to prioritize where we went on the landscape. And so what you see here is those areas in red are places where there's like 10 to 15 overlapping values that are achieved by treating that one patch of ground. And those are represented in this brochure that I can share later if folks are interested, which kind of tracks our process, just going from the stereotypes we had about each other to realizing our shared values and seeing that, if we work together, we could start to make a difference at the landscape scale. And that manifests in the Somes Bar Integrated Fire Management Project, which is our first landscape scale project that looked at this area where fire had been excluded for over 100 years around all these mid-slope properties that were at extreme risk because of fire exclusion. And just this year, in fact, we had the 2021 McCash fire burned into a corner of one of our treatment areas, and it's spotted right next to this home into one of our fuel breaks, and firefighters were able to easily put it out. So already it's having an effect. The reality is we've had 3 wildfires burn into the project footprint while we were treating it. So time is short, fire is pressing our hand. You know, but at the same time, collaborative projects like the Somes Bar Integrated Fire Management Project are, you know, it takes time to do collaboration, and I think you have to do that in order to proceed in a good way. And you know, I think you guys are lucky with Alex Miyagishima down there with the BLM. I think your relationship is much less fraught than between the tribes and the Forest Service in our area. I will say though, if you are looking at projects on public lands, you can ask for them to also do NEPA on the adjacent private lands. Because if you're doing a large scale fire project or fuels project on the public side, you know, the private landowners deserve that same treatment so that they can feel safe when those burns are happening on adjacent public lands. Some of the cool things about the Somes project were, you know, we fully analyzed the no action alternative. Up until that point, you know, fire exclusion wasn't even talked about, but essentially the no action alternative was the fire exclusion alternative, which we're spending billions of dollars a year on, and yet everybody's acting like it doesn't happen because it's a quote emergency. So the other cool thing was, you know, combining traditional knowledge as a form of best available science and moving away from single species management. Like you see here, these gray blobs are all the suitable habitat for spotted owl that were stopping us from working in certain places at certain times, to more holistic management, looking at a suite of species and then developing prescriptions together that met the needs of those multiple species. And then just having integrated field crews. It's been an amazing journey. I will say, and I don't want to scare you, but the foundation for working together with partners is agreements, you know, stewardship agreements, supplemental project agreements, MOUs. You know, these are the things that allow multiple resources from different areas to work together. And if anybody's interested, we have tons of examples that we could share. Now, I see it's 6:45 and I should probably finish up here pretty quick, and I've got a lot of slides to go. So I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. But in the past 19 years of burning, we've overcome a lot of the obstacles around prescribed fire. Some of them, like insurance and liability, continue to rear their ugly head every time we think we've bested it. But you know, the reality is that we're running one of the largest training programs in the country right now for prescribed fire in the West, at least in particular. We were blessed to have Kai Ostro and Bryceland folks up this fall to burn with us at the Klamath Treks and Happy Camp. And you know, I just want to say quickly, you know, this unit, like the West Sims burn, we didn't do any pre-treatment in the interior of the unit. We did a perimeter thin, you know, 100 foot perimeter thin just to contain the fire. We burned it all night long from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. right after a red flag warning ended and right before a red flag warning began the next day in 2015. So you can implement fire in you know, in shoulder seasons, I'll say it, you know, closer to wildfire than most people think. And you can get really good effects. Orleans has been a huge success story where we've been slowly building these landscape scale fuel breaks around the town, which I think is largely responsible why that, you know, Orleans hasn't been more heavily impacted from wildfires. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned is, you know, it's important as a community to define that line, you know, that, you know, where you're managing wildfires to, and then from that line where you're bringing prescribed fire and fuels reduction into your community, because that's what resilience looks like. Is you have the front country treated with prescribed fire and fuels management, so that wildfires can burn in the backcountry again. These are just some of the successes from recent Trex events. You know, people trained, media, acres. You know, the real magic is people burning together from different disciplines and you know, learning fire together again after so long, it not being a practice of common people. You know, it's been controlled by state and federal agencies for so long. It's just so refreshing to see people taking back fire. You know, in the East, they never gave up their use of fire. When Pinchot's Dixie Crusaders came in the 19 teens to take fire away, they sent them packing. So, you know, I think it's really inspiring to see this happen, and just so many people touched with good fire. You know, and I think that's the reality, is our job is to touch as many people with good fire that are touched with bad fire, which is a tough job in California today. I'm proud to say we haven't had any escapes, and we've done some complex burns like this burn on the Ishipishi unit in New Orleans, you know, 100% slope above, you know, 20, 30 different residences at the bottom of the slope, knife edge ridge fire lines, you know, smoke issues. Part of it is communicating about smoke, and I think these graphics that show the difference between the smoke we produce during the Trex event that you see on that bottom line, you know, the level of smoke that we produce, and that, you know, just pales in comparison to the wildfires that happen every year. So that's been one way that we get around that. So, you know, the all hands all lands model has become more of a tool for us, and basically that's you know, the difference is that, you know, Trex is this kind of preset date thing where you're bringing people from around the country, you're bringing resources from far and wide. But all hands all lands relies on interagency local resources that are implemented around burn windows as they arise, and so it's more of fluid, and it's really prioritizing the burn window, which, you know, that's the problem, is that humans have a hard time adjusting their schedule to fit what's going on in the landscape. So that's helped us, especially during COVID when we couldn't access that larger workforce. This is just an example of, you know, the diversity of the participants, from RCDs to volunteer fire departments, tribes, NGOs. I will say, you know, it's super important to engage the volunteer fire departments. They have so many resources, and we can work together towards a common purpose. I think SoHum is doing a better job than many places on that. But, you know, the reality is we can grow together. You know, before we started the Trex events, our local volunteer fire department was about to fold. Its average age of its members was 65 years old. They have very few people, but as people got the fire training and got engaged through Trex, they started signing up for the volunteer fire department. Now the average age is 35. They've got a new water tender that we, you know, pay them, you know, $30,000 to $40,000 a year to bring out on burns, and that money, that funding, gives them the ability to pay their bills and insurance and build a new fire hall. So, yeah, these are just photos of recent burns. This is the Lower Camp burn. It was about a 100-acre burn on the west side of Orleans along a ceremonial trail, where we didn't even use a fire line at the top. We just used a wet line. Unfortunately, we had a prefrontal wind event that caused the little 8-acre slop over that had us puckered for a moment. I had landowners, you know, some landowners calling and telling me they're going to sue us. But the inspiring thing was, you know, we also had almost 20 landowners of their own volition show up with their fire gear, who were fire qualified, and plug into our operation to give us the resources when all our guys were broke off. to punch in a bunch of lines and catch this thing. So that builds trust in a community when you can show, that everybody's got their back. So this last year we went really crazy. We had a 7-week long planned treks, all hands, all lands, mashup model. We burned 700 acres of piles, 160 acres of broadcast, including some cultural burning. It was an incredible time. And I think, it's so critical to support our Native partners in bringing fire back on their terms. I missed my pop's last birthday to go burn with Margot down in Witchpeck. And it was just, it was a day when fire was, did what it's supposed to do. Just moving across the land, burning these young firs out of these beautiful old oak wood stands. It's so important for us to empower our Native fire practitioners in this day and age to do what they know how to do. This is just an example of some of the resources our last treks had, local resources. Yeah, this is the Tashonic burn down in Orleans, bringing the school kids out to check out the burn. And they got to learn from some basket weavers why we were doing it. This was a basket weaver led burn. It was to burn the willow hot enough to make new shoots for baskets. So yeah, I think I'm probably getting close to time here. So I have so much to share with you guys. I'm just always overly ambitious. But we really need to think about scaling up our prescribed burns like this patch here, above my folks' place on the Salmon River. That's where I live on the lower Salmon River. And I was going to talk about this reburn and pods modeling. I will say, we are hosting a series of pods or potential operational delineations meetings for the North Coast, as well as the Klamath and all the regions within North Coast Resource Partnership. And this is a huge opportunity to start to have those conversations about landscape scale fire management, how we share risk decisions, and how we can start to make space for larger scale prescribed fire as well as manage wildfire. That reburn modeling is a piece of that, which is a little more complex than I want to go into right now. Because we built this strong foundation through WKRP, we've gotten over $10 million in CAL FIRE funds in the last 3 years, and we just received word we're going to be starting to get our Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program funding, which is $4 million a year for 10 years, starting in this spring. So good things are happening. I encourage people to read the good fire policy paper that the Croup Fire Policy Group put together, including great folks like Lanya Quinn Davidson, Sarah Clark, Don Hankins, Bill Tripp, and others. So yeah, that's Ikaria Tuiship in the background. I've been working for 20 years to support the tribe to restore one of the few ceremonies, world renewal ceremonies that hasn't been brought back. And every new moon in September, they would put fire on the top of that mountain and it would burn out to the landscape. So we're getting close. Our next WKRP project is a 12,000 acre project to restore that fire ceremony, to set the stage for that fire ceremony to come back. And now my brother, who's in the foreground here, he's cutting these tiny little trees with our brushing crews in the winter when he can't log, and he's teaching our local crews how to run a chainsaw. And I'm teaching my kids how to run a drip torch. My kids are the ones on the upper slope there where we were burning with Sasha Berleman down at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center a couple months ago. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay. I'm gonna
all right,
figure this thing out.
Thank you, Will, for joining us tonight. And so we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the evening. And Will, you're still the host here. So I guess I'd start with the question and then invite others to either put something into the chat, or if you want to get into the security settings and allow people to unmute themselves, that'll be fine too. But I guess to get the question started, I was wondering, because obviously, we've got a lot of wilderness down here in the King Range Conservation Area, and I know you've got a lot of wilderness lands up there. I wondered about prescribed burning in designated wilderness areas, and if that's something that you've been allowed to do, or if most of that fire has been naturally occurring.
Yeah, we did support the Trinity Alps Prescribed Fire Project, which was up around the triple junction between the Trinity, the Klamath, and the Six Rivers National Forest. And unfortunately, that project, which was actually instigated by Bill Tripp, who said, "Hey, you put out a natural fire that was supposed to bring fire back to this area." And so it's our obligation to bring fire back to these areas where we've suppressed fire in a good way, in a timely manner. And so some progressive folks within the Forest Service planned that project, went through the NEPA, but unfortunately some political players, some county supervisors effectively blocked it from implementation. And since then it's burned in wildfires with less beneficial effect. So and then the Klamath National Forest had a wilderness prescribed fire that got away, the Red Rocks fire, which kind of put a damper on things for a while too. So I don't think we've seen the last of wilderness prescribed burning, but at least locally in our landscape, there's been some hiccups, even though we pushed on it.
And do you know of any examples of other places within the country that have had success with prescribed fire in wilderness?
Not specifically. I know a lot of places like the Selway Bitterroot and the Frank Church wilderness where they're using managed wildfires effectively, where folks are, where federal managers are not suppressing wildfires, and they're using recent fire footprints to contain those fires. And the cool thing is they've developed ways to communicate with affected communities about sharing that risk, because that's really what it comes down to, is the communities that could be affected by those wildfires, need to have a say when federal managers are deciding whether or not to let them burn.
Thanks so much. Looks like Don might have a question.
Yeah, and I think folks can unmute themselves. Yes. Hey, Don.
Hey, Will, it's great to see you. I loved your talk. Thanks for coming. I was particularly impressed by how wonderfully you and your community have all come together from really disparate places. And I like this shared values perspective of the process of bringing all that together. And I know it's not something you started, in August and is working perfectly now. I know you've done it for a long time, but I'm just wondering, has that process, are you working with people in other states that are dealing with, wildfires? Are you working with people outside of our local area to share this process? I think it's just remarkable. And I'm just wondering how you're able to sort of spread that knowledge of the strength of community and shared values to make something this monumental happen.
Yeah, I'm a prostitute for presentations. You get 4 people together in a room and I'll talk to them excitedly for over an hour. So I'm talking with the Pennsylvania Game and Fish Commission here in a couple of weeks. And so we are, and other folks like Bill Tripp and Karuna Greenberg are co-leads with WKRP, and others are presenting and sharing it. I have to give a shout out to the Nature Conservancy, and in particular, Mary Huffman, who was the amazing facilitator, who was able to come in as that kind of neutral third party from the outside with no local baggage, to help us walk through that process. And so I think, for us communities who've been warring for a long time over resource issues, that professional facilitation is key, but there definitely are places, Firescape Mendocino was, came out of the work in the Klamath, and it's been implemented elsewhere.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for doing that, and two, for sharing that with us tonight. And I don't want to take up anybody else's time, but I do have one other quick question. I really liked one thing that you said about fire having different intentions, right? And so you can have some fire that is set for sort of renewing basketry, and some fire that's burned hotter for different things. Can you just tell me a little bit more about like the nuance of fire? It's not just like you just burn it super hot, you start and you just go. It's really more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so humbling to hear folks like Cutter tribal members like Kathy McCovey and Bill Tripp speak about their relationship to fire, because it really blows your mind how complex basically Cutter people managed, hundreds of thousands of acres as a food forest. And how they talk about it, say, for instance, in the Orleans Valley, was the men would be burning 1/3 of the north side of the valley for hunting the same year that the women would be burning for basket materials on the south side of the river. And so the men would be drawing the deer away from the basket materials, so the deer wouldn't be browsing the basket sticks. They would be going to the fresh grass, the preferred browse on the other side of the river. So they were literally herding animals with fire around the landscape and actually taking them away from where the women were trying to propagate basket materials. And then after a 3-year cycle, they would have burned the entire Orleans Valley. So every 3 years, up to the nearest ridge line, roughly a mile or two away, was getting burned.
Thanks for sharing that. That's fascinating stuff. Yeah. Anybody else have something they'd like to chat with Will about, or any final thoughts from you, Will? I know you're not feeling well. We don't want to keep you all night. I mean, I could chat with you about this all night, but are there any other questions from the group?
I mean, I'm interested in hearing about the Lost Coast and your folks' thoughts about fire and where you're at in the process. My experience being on the Humboldt County Fire Safe Council and working with more coastal communities is there's less engagement with wildfires, less sense of a threat, because the fire regimes, it's easier to put out fires in the coastal redwood belt, even though the kind of whoop ass that's coming from fire is just more delayed, but when it comes, it's going to be even worse than what we've been experiencing. So I'm just wondering, what's going on in the Kings Range and how is the community organizing around fire?
I don't know if anybody else wants to take this, but the King Range recently got a $4.5 million grant, federal grant, for doing fuels reduction work. And they recently did a community meeting to show some maps and show people what they were thinking. And so there's definitely a lot of talk these days about fire resiliency. And I think, within recent years, it feels like, it's a real buzz word locally. And it's exciting to see such a big investment in the King Range for, that the BLM could get that for fuel reduction work. And so while I'm certainly not an expert myself, the idea is through lecture series like these is we give people an opportunity to talk more about fire, to learn about things that people like yourself are doing in other communities, and also to even get on the ground. And like I was mentioning, for folks who tuned in early, we're planning a fire hike with members of the BLM fire team to get out into the King Range, to look at some of this fuel reduction work and to talk about the fire history in the King Range. And so I think events like that are really important for just building the knowledge base, and having people talk more in their own neighborhoods about things they can do in small group form to be able to make some of these changes. I mean, we see a lot of overgrown forests in the King Range, certainly, and I think in the local area. And I've just been impressed with I live in the Salmon Creek community, and there's a lot of talk these days about the need to protect the oak woodlands and the need to reintroduce fire. And that was something that wasn't really talked about much until recent years. And so I think that's a positive thing of some of these apocalyptic fires we've been seeing. But yeah, I don't know, maybe somebody who's on our call here who's more a part of the local fire scene could share a little bit more about their thoughts about what's happening here. Anybody want to take the lead on that? Don't be shy. You guys you can unmute yourself, and I think we have the settings set up so anybody can unmute themselves and share some feedback or ask another question. And seeing none, perhaps we're at that point in the evening where we tune out, unless there's anybody else that has questions. Dawn, I see you. You have any more to ask?
Well, I think Kai just put something in the chat that said they wanted to, let me see. Or Kai, do you want to unmute and chat, or do you want me to? I can just read this off if you'd like. They said one thing that we really have going for us on the coast is the earlier burn windows. I know we don't want to get down in the weeds about the pods, but I wanted to get a general idea from you about how well it translates into predominantly urban interface zones. Is it fairly straightforward, or does it take significantly more time and evaluation?
You really struck on a good point, Kai, that we're working on right now, which is that, pods were initially developed by the Forest Service kind of as a public lands planning tool. But what we're attempting to do through this North Coast Resource Partnership grant, and what we've been working on for many years in Orleans in particular, and some in Happy Camp, is to, kind of bring that cross-boundary pods layer planning into communities. And so what you see as your pods come closer to the towns, the polygons shrink, and they start less looking like watersheds that are kind of breaking on ridge systems, and more breaking on sub-ridge systems or roads, or basically the outlines of large burn units. So the nuance of the pods gets much smaller, averaging 500 acres instead of 5,000 or 15,000 acres. So it's historic use, but it's being repurposed by us and others in Southern Oregon. Ashland has been doing some similar work. Basically, again, it's where we conceptualize this place that we're managing wildfires to, and then from that point managing with prescribed fire and fuels reduction into our communities. So we've got a long ways to go to get there, but really what it comes down, pods is a tool for fire managers to communicate with affected communities about risk, the relative risk, because if we keep choosing to suppress all fires, we know at some point we're going to get that fire that's just unstoppable, and it's going to burn down the community. And so once we start to get these prescribed burns around our community and feel a little bit more safe and have some fuel breaks in place, there will be a day when we say, hey, we support you, fire manager Alex. We support you in managing that wildfire to a bigger footprint, because we know that big wildfire footprint is the only thing that's going to stop that wind-driven Slater fire type fire, that comes during those extreme weather events. We need, like, for instance, we had a lightning bust in mid-May this year, earlier than we had seen it ever before. And I pleaded with the Klamath National Forest supervisor to manage some of those lightning strikes to larger, to existing field breaks. Instead of putting it out at 5 acres, let it go to 500 or 5,000. But because those mechanisms for talking about shared risk aren't there, the safe political decision for those fire managers is to just put them all out. So we need to get away from that to, not be passing that risk on to future generations, onto our kids.
And it looks like we have another question from Pamela Lauer with the Whale Gulch Fire Safe Council. She's asked, she says, we're pretty new volunteer group. We're trying to support our local Whale Gulch Fire Department in doing fuel reduction in our community. Any advice for amping up our grant allocations?
Yeah, well, fire safe councils are a great tool. When we started, the California Fire Safe Council was the primary funder for that type of stuff. I think CAL FIRE has really stepped in as a major funder. I would recommend going after CAL FIRE fire prevention funding. And I think the cool thing about this point in history is that you can make the case that a quarter, a fifth of your grant funds go towards building your capacity, getting those people on staff, or just being able to have enough people to grow out the program. When we first started, it was all about, you got X amount of dollars for X amount of acres, but that didn't leave anything for those program managers and project coordinators and, to do all the other things it takes to run an organization. So, I think number one, there's a lot of great existing grant proposals out there to crib from. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. If you want some funded CAL FIRE grants or funded federal grants, reach out to organizations that are getting funded and get those proposals and learn from them. And then you can start building programs off that funding and make sure to not cut yourself too short so you have room to grow.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.